My wife said her affair was just emotional. The security footage told a different story. The first time my wife admitted she was having an affair, she corrected my vocabulary before she apologized. Celeste sat at our kitchen island with both hands wrapped around a mug she had not touched and told me it was not physical, it was just emotional. She said the word just as if it reduced the betrayal to something weightless, something that could be swept away with the crumbs from breakfast. 3 days later, I watched security footage of her pressing another woman against the locked door of Suite 814, kissing her with the kind of hunger Celeste had spent 6 months telling me she no longer felt for anyone. The footage would have been devastating if that had been all it showed. It was not. 2 minutes after they disappeared inside, my employee access code opened the service elevator, and a hotel safe containing $84,000 was rolled out under my name. I had been married to Celeste for 7 years. We met when I was 29 and still believed reliability was the same thing as safety. I managed operations at the Bellwether, a privately owned boutique hotel built inside an old newspaper headquarters. Celeste designed commercial interiors and could make a room look expensive without making it feel cold. She came to supervise a lobby renovation, argued with me about emergency exit clearance, and asked me to dinner after proving that both of us had been wrong. I loved her quick mind, her confidence, and the way she seemed to notice beauty before anyone else. For years, I thought she loved the quieter things in me: patience, caution, and the ability to keep 100 moving parts from colliding. Our marriage did not collapse dramatically. It thinned. Celeste began taking calls on the balcony. She changed the passcode on her phone and called it a cybersecurity habit. She worked late on a redevelopment project for the Bellwether's ownership group, though the project had not reached the stage that required late nights. When I asked whether she was unhappy, she said she was exhausted by my need to turn every mood into an operational problem. I began doubting instincts that had guided my entire career. At work, I could detect a false fire alarm from the pattern of sensor failures. At home, I accepted explanations that did not survive a second question. The other woman was Vivian Shaw, a financial consultant hired by the hotel's majority owner, Adrian Vale. Vivian was polished in a way that made every conversation feel like a negotiation she had already won. She first appeared at executive meetings 6 months before Celeste's confession. She asked unusually detailed questions about vendor authorization, camera retention, master keys, and the limits of my emergency credentials. I answered because those questions could have been legitimate. Celeste later teased me for being suspicious of anyone who wore shoes that cost more than my first car. I laughed with her. That memory would eventually make me angrier than the obvious lies. Celeste confessed only because I found a message preview on our shared tablet. Vivian had written, "I cannot keep pretending I do not miss waking up beside you." Celeste saw me holding the tablet and went very still. She did not deny the relationship. Instead, she delivered a careful explanation that sounded rehearsed. They had become close while working late. Vivian understood the pressure she was under. They had crossed emotional boundaries, but nothing physical had happened. Celeste said she had already ended it and wanted to rebuild our marriage. She cried without losing control of her breathing. I asked how anyone could miss waking up beside someone if they had never slept together. Celeste said the message referred to an overnight work retreat where several people had stayed in adjacent rooms. She accused Vivian of using dramatic language. Then she looked directly at me and said, I could either believe the woman I had loved for 7 years or destroy us over one ambiguous sentence. That was the first trap. She made trust sound like the refusal to observe. I did not agree to forgive her. I agreed not to decide that night. We slept in separate rooms, and Celeste began performing remorse with astonishing discipline. She shared her calendar, suggested counseling, and sent Vivian a no-contact message while I watched. She removed Vivian from social media. Every gesture was technically correct. None of it made me feel safer. The details were too smooth, like a guest room staged for inspection after someone had already removed the evidence. At the Bellwether, my unease became professional. A night auditor named Mateo reported that cash from a private charity auction had been moved from the accounting safe into Suite 814 on the evening of the event. The suite had served as a temporary counting room because the ballroom office was under repair. The following morning, accounting found the sealed cash case intact and transferred it to the bank. At least, that was what the log said. 2 weeks later, the charity claimed the deposit was short by $84,000. Adrian Vale called an emergency meeting. He treated the shortage as an embarrassment rather than a crime. Vivian presented a preliminary review showing that my credentials had accessed the service elevator and the 8th floor secure corridor at 11:42 that night. I had been downstairs managing a medical emergency involving an elderly guest. More than 30 people had seen me in the lobby, but credentials were considered stronger evidence than memories. Vivian said access codes could be mishandled without malicious intent. Her tone was sympathetic. Celeste sat beside her as the project designer and avoided looking at me. I requested the security footage. Vivian said the relevant camera files had been corrupted during a server migration. Our head of security, Daniel Cho, looked surprised, but Adrian ended the discussion before he could speak. He ordered a confidential internal review and temporarily suspended my administrator privileges. I left the room, understanding that my marriage and career were not separate disasters. Someone had used my identity inside the hotel, and both women with reasons to lie were sitting across from me. Daniel found me in the loading dock 10 minutes later. He had worked with me for 9 years and did not waste words. The primary footage had been deleted, but the Bellwether system maintained a rolling disaster recovery copy on an isolated server. Only Daniel and I knew the backup existed because we had installed it after a ransomware scare. Restoring a specific night would take hours and create an audit entry. He asked whether I wanted him to do it before the internal review team locked him out. I told him to preserve everything, follow chain of custody procedure, and notify outside counsel. I did not ask him to show me anything privately. Part of me wanted to sit in his office and search until I found a harmless explanation. The more experienced part knew evidence becomes fragile when a desperate person touches it alone. Daniel called the hotel's independent attorney, Margaret Ellis, and restored the files in her presence. By midnight, they had enough to ask me to come in. Margaret met me in a windowless conference room beneath the ballroom. A laptop sat on the table beside 2 sealed evidence drives. Before she played the recording, she warned me that it involved my spouse and might be painful. I thought I was prepared because Celeste had already admitted the emotional affair. I expected a private conversation, an embrace, perhaps one kiss that would turn her careful confession into another lie. I did not expect to see Celeste enter Suite 814 at 10:16 wearing the red dress she had told me was for a client dinner across town. Vivian arrived 11 minutes later. The hallway camera had no audio, but it did not need any. Vivian slid an arm around Celeste's waist. Celeste pulled her closer. Their kiss lasted long enough for the motion detection marker to divide it into 2 recorded events. They went inside and did not emerge for 73 minutes. When they did, Celeste's hair was loose, Vivian carried her shoes, and both of them were laughing. My body reacted before my mind did. My hands went numb. I stared at the timestamp because numbers were easier than faces. While they were in the suite, someone wearing a catering jacket entered through the service corridor. The person used a cloned version of my access code, opened the counting room, and wheeled out the charity safe inside a laundry cart. A second camera captured Vivian meeting the cart near the freight elevator. Celeste stood watch at the corner. The safe returned 40 minutes later. The seals visible on the outside appeared unchanged. Daniel enlarged the image and showed me a small cut along the bottom edge of one security band. Someone had opened the cash case, removed money, and replaced the seal with a convincing copy. At 1:08 in the morning, Celeste used a cloth to wipe the door handle and elevator panel. Then Vivian entered the security office with Adrian's temporary executive card and accessed the camera server. There was more. The system recorded Vivian deleting the primary footage. She did not know that the deletion itself triggered a mirrored log on the isolated backup. Celeste stood behind her reading instructions from her phone. At one point, Vivian turned and kissed her again beneath the security office camera. The casualness of it was almost worse than the scene outside the suite. They were not overwhelmed by forbidden feeling. They were comfortable partners completing a task. I watched the full sequence twice. On the second viewing, grief gave way to detail. Celeste knew which cameras had blind spots because she had reviewed sightlines during the renovation. She knew my access code because she had seen me use it at home during an emergency call. Vivian knew the server migration schedule because she had requested it. Their affair had given them privacy, but their scheme had given the affair a purpose. I could no longer tell whether they had fallen in love and then committed a crime, or planned the crime and discovered that betraying me was part of the excitement. Margaret asked whether Celeste had access to my work devices. I told her about the shared tablet and our home office. She advised me not to confront her, not to change visible routines, and not to remove anything from the house without guidance. The hotel's insurer and law enforcement would need to be notified. Daniel disabled the cloned credential without alerting the internal dashboard. We agreed I would remain officially suspended while they examined whether the theft was part of something larger. Driving home, I remembered every time Celeste had called me paranoid. I remembered apologizing for noticing that Vivian's perfume lingered on her coat. I remembered counseling sessions Celeste had suggested but never scheduled, anniversaries shortened by sudden client crises, and a weekend when she claimed food poisoning, while hotel records later showed Vivian occupying Suite 814. The affair was not a single boundary crossed in confusion. It was an architecture of lies, and I had been living inside it. Celeste was asleep when I arrived, or pretending to be. I stood in the doorway and felt a strange distance from the woman in our bed. Only hours earlier, I had still thought of her as my wife who had hurt me. Now she was a person who had helped frame me for felony theft. The distinction steadied me. I moved to the guest room, locked the door, and wrote down everything I could remember while the timeline was fresh. The next morning, Celeste made coffee and asked whether the hotel had found anything. I said the backup systems were complicated. Her hand paused above the sugar bowl for less than a second. Then she told me I should cooperate fully and not let my defensiveness make me look guilty. She suggested that I may have left my code somewhere careless. It was an elegant piece of manipulation. Concern on the surface, blame underneath, and a warning that she already understood how investigators might see me. I asked whether Vivian had contacted her. Celeste looked wounded. She reminded me that she had ended the relationship. She said continuing to interrogate her would make reconciliation impossible. I let my face soften and apologized. The apology tasted poisonous, but she relaxed. That reaction confirmed what the cameras already had. She did not want forgiveness. She wanted control of the story. For the next week, I lived two lives. At home, I acted uncertain and ashamed. I attended one counseling session with Celeste and listened while she described the affair as an emotional refuge created by my long work hours. At the hotel, I met Margaret and two detectives in a rented office across town. Daniel provided access logs. The charity's forensic accountant traced the missing cash through a network of shell vendors that had received inflated payments from the Bellwether redevelopment budget. One vendor, Northline Spatial, supposedly supplied custom lighting fixtures. Its invoices carried Celeste's approval and Vivian's financial authorization. The company had no warehouse, no employees, and a mailing address at a private mailbox. Over 18 months, the Bellwether had paid it $640,000. The charity theft had not been their first crime. It had been a temporary cash grab meant to cover a payment that auditors were about to question. The detectives believed a third person had moved the safe. The catering jacket obscured the face, but gate analysis and parking records pointed to Vivian's younger brother, Owen. His debts included sports betting and a recent civil judgment. Phone records placed him near the hotel. He was arrested quietly on an unrelated probation violation and began cooperating before Vivian knew he was missing. Owen said Vivian had described the scheme as harmless redistribution from wealthy owners who would never notice. Celeste created fake design changes, Vivian approved vendors, and Owen transferred money through accounts opened under other people's information. My credentials were their insurance policy. If the charity shortage triggered scrutiny, evidence would lead to me, the operations manager with complete building access. Celeste had supplied photographs of my identification and samples of my electronic signature. Hearing that hurt differently from seeing the affair. A kiss could be explained as selfish desire. Copying my passport, tax records, and signature required calm preparation. Celeste had stood in our home office while I slept 10 feet away and assembled the materials to ruin me. She had kissed me good morning after deciding I was disposable. Margaret wanted more evidence connecting Vivian to the shell accounts. The detectives could move immediately on the theft, but arresting them too soon might leave most of the money hidden. Owen said Vivian kept an encrypted ledger on a portable drive and carried it whenever she feared an audit. Celeste did not know the full account structure. That imbalance explained why Vivian appeared confident, while Celeste seemed increasingly tense. We set a controlled pressure campaign. Adrian announced that outside auditors would review every redevelopment expense and that suspended employees might be reinstated if the security data cleared them. Daniel allowed a false rumor to spread that corrupted footage had been partially recovered but was too damaged to identify faces. Margaret scheduled an internal hearing for Friday and required Celeste and Vivian to attend separately. At home, Celeste began watching me more closely. She asked what I remembered about the charity night. She wanted to know whether the medical emergency had kept me in the lobby continuously. I said I was confused and might have gone upstairs for a few minutes. Relief moved across her face before she concealed it. She encouraged me to tell investigators that uncertainty. I realized she was trying to make my own statement support the forged access records. That evening, she attempted tenderness for the first time in months. She sat beside me on the sofa and rested her head on my shoulder. She said losing me had frightened her into understanding what mattered. I remained still while remembering her laughter in the hallway. Her affection now felt like someone testing a locked door. When she kissed my cheek, I wondered whether she could feel how completely I had left the marriage. I did not sleep. Near 2 in the morning, Celeste slipped out of bed and took her phone into the laundry room. A monitoring warrant allowed detectives to capture her call to Vivian. Celeste said the recovered footage might show more than they expected. Vivian told her not to panic and reminded her that I was the only person whose credentials appeared in the official logs. Celeste asked what would happen if I remembered seeing Owen. Vivian's response was cold. Then they would make my instability the issue. The following day, Celeste told our therapist that I had become obsessive and forgetful. She described me misplacing keys, repeating questions, and imagining patterns. Most of the examples were invented, but some were ordinary mistakes stretched into symptoms. I understood the next layer of their plan. If evidence surfaced, Celeste would portray me as an exhausted manager who had stolen money and constructed an affair accusation to deflect blame. Vivian had financial records. Celeste had intimate credibility. Together, they could make truth look like a breakdown. I asked the therapist for a private minute after the session and gave her Margaret's card. I said there was an active investigation and requested that she preserve her notes. I did not explain further. The therapist's expression changed as she understood that Celeste's clinical-sounding narrative might itself be evidence. For once, I watched one of their traps close without me inside it. Friday arrived with heavy rain. The internal hearing took place in the Bellwether's old press room, a dramatic space Adrian used for board meetings. The restored printing machinery remained behind glass along one wall. Vivian arrived in a gray suit with an attorney. Celeste wore navy and carried the leather portfolio I had given her on our 5th anniversary. I entered last with Margaret. Celeste looked genuinely startled to see me. She had expected a frightened, suspended employee, not someone represented by the hotel's independent counsel. Vivian recovered faster. She whispered to her attorney and placed a small black drive inside her portfolio. A detective watching from the adjacent room confirmed the movement through a live camera. Adrian opened the hearing by stating that the purpose was to review credential misuse and financial discrepancies. Vivian presented first. She described weaknesses in my access management, periods when I had worked alone, and alleged tension between me and hotel ownership over denied bonuses. Her slides were polished. If I had not seen the footage, I might have admired the construction. Every true fact was positioned beside a false implication. Celeste followed. She said our marriage had been strained and that I had become secretive about money. She admitted an emotional attachment to Vivian, but insisted they had never been physically intimate. According to her, my jealousy might have influenced my account of workplace events. She spoke with sadness rather than anger, offering herself as a reluctant witness against someone she still loved. When Margaret asked whether Celeste had ever entered Suite 814 with Vivian, Celeste said no. When asked whether she had been at the hotel on the charity night, she said she left before 9. When asked whether she had accessed my identification documents, she said spouses naturally shared records. Each answer tightened the case. Margaret did not challenge her. She simply recorded the denial. Vivian's attorney requested that the hearing end because the questions had become personal. Adrian looked toward Margaret. She nodded to Daniel, who dimmed the room. The first footage shown was not the affair. It was a clean lobby recording, proving I had remained with paramedics from 11:19 until after midnight. Then came the service elevator, the cloned credential, and Owen pushing the laundry cart. Vivian's expression hardened. Celeste's mouth opened slightly. She looked at me as if I had broken an agreement by possessing the truth. Next, Daniel played the hallway camera outside Suite 814. Celeste watched herself kiss Vivian. Her earlier phrase, "never physically intimate," remained on the transcript in front of every board member. The room became so silent that rain against the windows sounded like thrown gravel. I did not watch the screen. I watched Celeste understand that the version of reality she had built was no longer available. The recording continued through the removal of the safe, the wiped handles, and the deletion attempt. When Vivian appeared in the security office, her attorney told her not to say anything. She reached for the portfolio containing the black drive. 2 detectives entered before her hand arrived. Celeste turned to me and whispered that I did not understand. I told her she had already had 7 years to explain who she was. It was the only direct sentence I gave her that day. Everything else belonged to evidence. The detectives executed warrants for the drive, phones, and financial records. Vivian was arrested for conspiracy, theft, fraud, evidence tampering, and identity-related offenses. Celeste was arrested minutes later. She began crying only when an officer removed the portfolio from her hands. Her grief seemed directed less at me than at the collapse of options. Owen's cooperation led investigators to accounts holding most of the stolen redevelopment money. Northline Spatial connected to 2 more shell companies and a condominium purchased for Vivian through a trust. Celeste had received smaller transfers disguised as design consulting fees. Her total share was $190,000. That number appeared in newspapers months later, but to me it represented something more intimate, the price she had accepted for my reputation and freedom. The scandal moved quickly once charges became public. The Bellwether's owners issued a statement clearing me of wrongdoing and reinstating me with back pay. Adrian offered me a promotion to Chief Operating Officer. I did not accept immediately. He had ignored warning signs, allowed Vivian to control an investigation into her own conduct, and treated missing charity money as a reputation problem. Being proven innocent did not make the institution trustworthy. I negotiated instead. Daniel received independent authority over security. All executive credentials became subject to dual review. Vendor approvals required separation between design, finance, and operations. The charity was repaid with interest from the hotel's insurance recovery, and Adrian funded an external audit without limits. Only after those changes were signed did I accept the position. My personal life was less orderly. Celeste was released on bond and prohibited from contacting me except through attorneys. She sent a letter through her lawyer claiming Vivian had manipulated her. She said the affair began during a lonely period and gradually pulled her into financial decisions she did not understand. The letter described her as vulnerable, flattered, and afraid. It never explained the copied passport or the therapist session where she tried to make me seem unstable. I filed for divorce. Our house had to be sold because prosecutors placed a lien on Celeste's share. Packing exposed the archaeology of our marriage: ticket stubs, renovation sketches, holiday photographs, and a chipped blue bowl we bought on our first trip together. I did not hate every memory. That complicated the grief. The woman who betrayed me had also held my hand through my father's funeral and spent 3 nights helping me care for a sick dog. Love had been real, but it had not been strong enough to govern her choices. People wanted a simpler story. Some friends called Celeste a monster and expected that to comfort me. Others asked whether I had missed signs because I worked too much. Several disappeared because remaining neutral felt easier than confronting what she had done. My sister Nora stayed. She helped me pack without forcing conversation and removed every photograph only after asking. She understood that healing was not a dramatic declaration, it was a series of small permissions. The criminal case lasted 14 months. Vivian initially blamed Owen, then Celeste, then Adrian's accounting culture. The encrypted drive defeated each version. It contained payment schedules, forged invoices, credential data, and notes about possible scapegoats. My initials appeared beside the phrase, operational access plus marital instability. Celeste had added comments about my work habits and medical history. The document transformed their private cruelty into organized intent. Celeste eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy, wire fraud, and aggravated identity theft. Her attorney asked me to support a reduced sentence. He said she had no prior record and had been influenced by a more sophisticated offender. I declined to recommend a number, but I submitted a victim impact statement. I wrote that the stolen money could be measured and repaid. The damage to trust could not. Celeste had used the privileges of marriage as tools: access to my home, records, routines, vulnerabilities, and instinct to believe her. She had not merely hidden an affair, she had converted intimacy into evidence against me. Any sentence should account for the fact that I could have lost my career and freedom if a forgotten backup server had not preserved the truth. At sentencing, Celeste looked smaller than I remembered. She apologized to the court, the charity, the hotel, and finally to me. She said she had told herself each choice was temporary until the choices became a life she could not escape. I believed that part. People rarely wake up and decide to destroy everything. They make one selfish exception, then another, and eventually protecting the exceptions becomes more important than protecting anyone they love. The judge sentenced her to 38 months in federal prison and restitution. Vivian received more than 7 years. Owen received probation and home confinement because of his cooperation. None of the sentences gave me satisfaction in the way strangers expected. Accountability was necessary, but it did not restore the person I thought I had married. Therapy helped me separate vigilance from fear. For months, I checked door locks repeatedly and studied faces for concealed motives. I hated that Celeste had made suspicion feel responsible. My therapist reminded me that trust was not blindness. Healthy trust allowed questions and survived verification. What Celeste demanded had been surrender, not trust. I moved into a smaller apartment overlooking the river. The first night, I slept on a mattress surrounded by boxes and woke before dawn. For one panicked second, I reached toward the empty side of the bed. Then I remembered where Celeste was and why. I made coffee, opened the balcony door, and watched delivery trucks cross the bridge. The city continued without consulting my grief. At work, we rebuilt systems that had depended too heavily on personal confidence. I required documented approvals even when executives complained about inconvenience. I taught managers that internal controls were not accusations. They were ways of protecting honest people from being asked to prove innocence after damage occurred. The bellwether became safer because I stopped confusing trust with the absence of safeguards. Daniel preserved one still image from the restored footage for the legal archive: Celeste and Vivian entering the security office while Owen waited with the cart. I never kept a copy. The image had already taken enough from me. When the retention period ended, I signed the authorization allowing non-essential duplicates to be destroyed. Evidence had served its purpose. I did not need to build a shrine to betrayal. 2 years after the confession, the charity held another auction at the Bellwether. The same ballroom filled with donors, music, and too many flowers. This time, cash was counted under dual control and transferred immediately by armored courier. At the end of the night, Mateo handed me the final reconciliation report. Every dollar was present. I walked past Suite 814 before leaving. It had been renovated, renumbered, and painted a pale green. A honeymooning couple had placed a room service tray outside. I expected the corridor to trigger anger. Instead, it looked ordinary. That felt like victory. Nora waited downstairs to take me to a late dinner. On the way out, the lobby camera reflected in the glass above us. For years, I had thought the security footage was the thing that ended my marriage. In truth, the marriage had ended earlier, in dozens of choices Celeste made when she believed no one was watching. The camera had not destroyed anything, it had simply refused to participate in the lie. Celeste was right about one narrow point. Her affair had been emotional. It involved secrecy, dependence, shared ambition, resentment, and the thrill of building a world that excluded me. It was also physical, financial, and criminal. The word emotional had never been a boundary. It was camouflage. What I remember most now is not the kiss outside Suite 814. It is the moment after Margaret turned off the screen and asked what I wanted to do. I had felt hollow, humiliated, and frightened, yet my answer came without hesitation. Preserve everything. Follow the evidence. Do not warn them. That was the first decision of my new life. I used to believe survival would look like becoming impossible to deceive. I know better now. No one can protect herself from every lie without also protecting herself from love. Survival meant trusting my perceptions, requiring actions to match words, and refusing to carry shame that belonged to someone else. Celeste had tried to write me into her story as the jealous wife, the careless employee, and the convenient criminal. The footage gave me facts, but I was the one who chose not to disappear inside her version. The divorce decree arrived on a bright Tuesday morning. There was no dramatic hearing, only an email from my attorney and a stamped document ending 7 years in a few formal paragraphs. I printed it at work, signed where required, and put it in the secure shred bin after saving the official copy. Then I returned to a meeting about fire code upgrades. The ordinariness was almost merciful. That evening, Nora and I ate by the river. She raised a glass to beginnings, and I told her beginnings were overrated. Most lives did not restart cleanly. They continued with scars, better boundaries, and furniture that no longer matched. We laughed, and the sound did not feel borrowed from an earlier life. Months later, I began seeing a woman named Lena, a museum archivist who understood why preservation and release were not opposites. On our third date, I told her the broad shape of what happened. I expected the familiar fascination people showed toward scandal. Instead, she asked what made me feel safe now. The question was so simple that I nearly cried. I told her safety meant being allowed to notice. It meant a question did not become an accusation merely because the answer was uncomfortable. It meant privacy without secrecy and independence without punishment. Lena nodded and did not promise she would never hurt me. She promised to tell the truth even when the truth made her look bad. It was a smaller promise than forever, and because of that, I trusted it more. The Bellwether eventually received an ethics award from the City Hospitality Association. Adrian wanted me on stage for the photograph. I agreed only if Daniel, Mateo, and the accounting team stood beside me. Systems had saved me, but people had chosen to use them correctly. Daniel preserved the backup. Margaret protected the evidence. Mateo questioned a deposit that others wanted to dismiss. Truth rarely arrives through one heroic revelation. It survives because several people refuse to look away. After the ceremony, a young manager asked how I had known Celeste was lying. I told her I had not known at first. I had noticed inconsistency, and I had made the mistake of believing love required me to ignore it. The lesson was not to distrust everyone. It was to stop treating discomfort as proof that a question should remain unasked. I sometimes receive messages from strangers who read about the case. They ask how to recover deleted footage, how to confront a cheating spouse, or how to know when an explanation is false. I cannot solve their lives. I tell them to protect records legally, seek independent advice, and avoid confronting someone who may destroy evidence or become dangerous. Most importantly, I tell them that a minimizing word does not change the size of an act. Just emotional, just one mistake, just money, just a marriage that had already become difficult. Every just in Celeste's confession asked me to subtract my own reality until her choices seemed small enough to forgive. The security footage restored scale. It showed timestamps, doors, hands, faces, and deliberate steps. It turned abstraction back into action. I no longer define that year as the year my wife cheated on me. It was the year I learned how betrayal recruits silence, how institutions prefer convenient explanations, and how evidence can protect a person who has been trained to doubt herself. It was also the year I discovered that dignity is not something another person grants by treating you well. It is what remains when you refuse to help them mistreat you. On the third anniversary of the charity theft, I stood in the security room while technicians replaced the last server associated with the old system. The backup machine was obsolete, its fans loud and its casing scratched. Daniel asked if I wanted to keep the data plate as a souvenir. I said no. We watched the technician disconnect it and carry it away. For a second, the empty space on the rack looked larger than the machine had been. Then a new unit slid into place. Lights blinked, systems synchronized. The hotel continued recording entrances and exits, not because everyone inside was untrustworthy, but because memory is imperfect and power needs accountability. I went home to my apartment where Lena was cooking badly and singing confidently. My phone lay unlocked on the counter, not as proof, not as a test, but because I had nothing to stage. She looked up and asked how the replacement went. I told her the old server was finally gone. She understood I meant more than equipment. She did not ask whether I felt closure. Closure suggests a door that can be sealed so completely the room behind it stops existing. I did not need that. I needed the past to stay where it belonged, visible when necessary and incapable of controlling the next step. That night, rain moved across the windows in silver lines, reminding me of the hearing at the Bellwether. I thought briefly of Celeste sitting beneath the darkened screen, watching facts reclaim the room. I did not feel triumph. I felt distance. The affair had once seemed large enough to consume my whole identity. Now it was evidence in a closed case, a chapter people knew about me, but not the most important one. The most important chapter was everything I built after I stopped accepting her definitions. During the investigation, I learned how easily confidence can imitate credibility. Vivian never raised her voice, and Celeste rarely contradicted herself in obvious ways. They relied on listeners filling gaps in their favor. Each explanation was plausible when examined alone. Only the timeline revealed the structure. That realization changed the way I reviewed incidents at work. I stopped asking whether a story sounded reasonable and began asking whether all available facts could exist beside it. Reasonableness is a feeling. Consistency is something that can be tested. The most difficult nights were not the ones when I missed Celeste. They were the ones when I missed who I had been beside her. I had once moved through our home without evaluating every object as potential evidence. I had believed a shared password was intimacy, and an unlocked drawer was ordinary. Afterward, even kindness could make me search for motive. Recovery required learning that caution could be specific instead of permanent. I could protect financial records, maintain independent accounts, and still let another person know me. Adrian apologized privately for allowing Vivian to lead the preliminary review. His apology mattered less than the policy changes that followed. I told him remorse without altered authority was public relations. He did not enjoy hearing it, but he signed the reforms. That conversation taught me another distinction Celeste had blurred. An apology describes the speaker's feelings, while accountability changes what the speaker is permitted to do next. When reporters called, I refused television interviews. I did not want my worst week converted into dramatic background music. I released one written statement focused on the charity, the recovered funds, and the importance of independent controls. Some articles still reduced the case to a sensational love triangle. I could not control that. I could control whether I performed pain for strangers who would forget my name after the next scandal. I later discovered that Celeste and Vivian had used Suite 814 on at least 6 earlier occasions. Those recordings had aged out of normal retention, but reservation patterns and key logs remained. Each date corresponded with a night Celeste had described as work pressure. I stopped trying to rank the betrayals. Counting them did not make the truth more true. One deliberate lie would have been enough to require change. Hundreds merely explained why change had become unavoidable. The charity director sent me a handwritten note after the money was returned. She said the missing funds had delayed housing grants for families leaving domestic violence shelters. Until then, the theft had felt centered on me because my credentials were used. Her letter widened the frame. Celeste and Vivian had called the money abstract, but every stolen dollar had belonged to a planned roof, deposit, or locked door. Their scheme had victims they never bothered to imagine. At the plea hearing, Vivian did not look toward me. Her attention remained fixed on the prosecutor and the calculations that might shorten her sentence. Celeste looked repeatedly, searching my face for something I could not identify. Perhaps she wanted hatred, because hatred would prove a bond remained. I gave her nothing. Indifference was not yet natural, but boundaries sometimes begin as disciplined behavior before they become peace. My mother asked whether I regretted marrying Celeste. I said regret was too blunt. The marriage led me to friendships, skills, and parts of myself I would not discard. I regretted the years I spent negotiating against my own perception. I regretted every apology I offered merely to end a conversation in which I was correct. Those regrets became instructions rather than punishments. There was no single morning when I woke healed. Progress appeared in absences. I realized I had gone a day without replaying the footage, then a week without searching Celeste's name, then a month without checking whether strangers believed her. The nervous system measures freedom quietly. It loosens a shoulder, lengthens a breath, and allows an ordinary evening to remain ordinary. People often asked whether the cameras invaded privacy. The bellwether recorded public corridors, secure work areas, and access points under posted policies. It did not record inside guest rooms. The distinction mattered. The footage did not expose a private bedroom. It documented actions taken in shared and protected spaces during a theft. Celeste had tried to use privacy as a shield for conduct that endangered others. Privacy deserves protection, but secrecy does not erase accountability. During the investigation, I learned how easily confidence can imitate credibility. Vivian never raised her voice, and Celeste rarely contradicted herself in obvious ways. They relied on listeners filling gaps in their favor. Each explanation was plausible when examined alone. Only the timeline revealed the structure. That realization changed the way I reviewed incidents at work. I stopped asking whether a story sounded reasonable and began asking whether all available facts could exist beside it. Reasonableness is a feeling. Consistency is something that can be tested. The most difficult nights were not the ones when I missed Celeste. They were the ones when I missed who I had been beside her. I had once moved through our home without evaluating every object as potential evidence. I had believed a shared password was intimacy and an unlocked drawer was ordinary. Afterward, even kindness could make me search for motive. Recovery required learning that caution could be specific instead of permanent. I could protect financial records, maintain independent accounts, and still let another person know me. Adrian apologized privately for allowing Vivian to lead the preliminary review. His apology mattered less than the policy changes that followed. I told him remorse without altered authority was public relations. He did not enjoy hearing it, but he signed the reforms. That conversation taught me another distinction Celeste had blurred. An apology describes the speaker's feelings, while accountability changes what the speaker is permitted to do next. When reporters called, I refused television interviews. I did not want my worst week converted into dramatic background music. I released one written statement focused on the charity, the recovered funds, and the importance of independent controls. Some articles still reduced the case to a sensational love triangle. I could not control that. I could control whether I performed pain for strangers who would forget my name after the next scandal. I later discovered that Celeste and Vivian had used Suite 814 on at least 6 earlier occasions. Those recordings had aged out of normal retention, but reservation patterns and key logs remained. Each date corresponded with a night Celeste had described as work pressure. I stopped trying to rank the betrayals. Counting them did not make the truth more true. One deliberate lie would have been enough to require change. Hundreds merely explained why change had become unavoidable. The charity director sent me a handwritten note after the money was returned. She said the missing funds had delayed housing grants for families leaving domestic violence shelters. Until then, the theft had felt centered on me because my credentials were used. Her letter widened the frame. Celeste and Vivian had called the money abstract, but every stolen dollar had belonged to a planned roof, deposit, or locked door. Their scheme had victims they never bothered to imagine. My wife said her affair was just emotional. The security footage told a different story. The courts told another. The financial records told another still. But the final story belongs to me. I believed what I saw, protected the truth, and walked away before her lies could become my life.